Hi, my name is Mahdee, and today I'm going to be refuting Mahdee Refutation's claim that social media has harmful effects on mental health. Her three secondary claims are that social media has negative effects on a person's appearance, social media provides a platform for cyberbullying, and that social media provides an ability for social comparison. Our response to her first claim is that she fails to effectively describe what negative effects are a result of appearance comparison through social media. Her first point in her secondary claim is that social media provides ability for appearance comparison, and her primary evidence that she used was conducted by unspecified researchers. The credibility of research is an important aspect in identifying whether an evidence can be used as a good or bad evidence, and seeing that this was conducted by unspecified researchers, it's hard to tell whether this evidence is even capable of being taken as good evidence. She also provides no statistical evidence to provide any sort of measurable effect that social media has on a person's mental health. Statistical evidence will show a greater, more direct, serious relationship between this, and she fails to show that relationship. Her second point talks about likes, and the evidence she uses to demonstrate how likes affect social or mental health is very speculative, because most of it is estimation words such as may and plausible and predict. There's no real evidence showing a direct correlation between how likes affect a person's negative perception of their own body. And in this claim, she starts talking about a person's appearance and how social media affects that, but she ends it by talking about how social media affects a person's self-esteem, which is irrelevant to the claim that she proposes. To this, I want to also propose a counterclaim by Christopher Ferguson, an associate professor of psychology at Texas A&M International University, where a research was conducted where he surveyed 237 girls and asked them to identify and rate their favorite actresses, along with evaluating their height, weight, and social media use and peer competition. And these girls were evaluated again 6 months later to identify that there's no correlation to the way they see themselves in comparison to how they use social media. And my response to her secondary claim is that the impact of cyberbullying is less than the impact of traditional bullying. She claims that cyberbullying has a greater impact than traditional bullying, but a review study led by Professor Ann John, a professor of medicine with expertise in the area of suicide and self-harm, at Swansea University of Medicine, indicated that they found that cyberbullying raised the risk of self-harm and suicide behavior by 2.3%, while a study by Young Shin Kim, a child psychiatrist and assistant professor at Yale School of Medicine, Medicine's Child Study Center, and Bennett Levington, a professor of psychiatry at University of California, San Francisco, reviewed 37 studies on bullying and suicide across the planet in places like the United States, Canada, Europe, and South Africa, and indicated that connection between bullying and suicide was found that kids that go through bullying have a 2 to 9 times more likely chance of having suicidal thoughts, showing that cyberbullying has a less percent increase in suicidal thoughts compared to traditional bullying. My response to her third claim was that she fails to effectively describe how social comparison hurts mental health. In her first point, she says that social media pushes expectations on a person, and she quotes the social comparison theory, which only suggests that comparisons to people judged to be better than oneself will lead to negative consequences for mental health. Though the evidence is irrelevant because it does not offer any sort of it does not show any expectations that people are facing that affect their mental health. And she also provides no statistical evidence to prove how social comparison has led to any sort of mental harm in anyone. And she does provide a hypothetical example, but it does not show any sort of real serious connection between social media and one's mental health. She also defines something called FOMO, which is a fear of missing out, but she only defines this definition, doesn't really explain how this relates to harm towards mental health, providing no example of a measurable relationship between how FOMO has mentally harmed anybody. So in conclusion, though her presentation describes a possible relationship between social media and harm mental health, she fails to effectively describe the negative effects are a result of appearance comparison through social media, that the effects of cyberbullying aren't as severe as traditional bullying, and she fails to effectively describe how social comparison harms mental health. So we can conclude that social media has a minor harm on mental health. Thank you.
All right, structurally, it's pretty sound at the beginning. You identify the claims and the secondary claims that you're dealing with. On the first point, you challenge the evidence that's being used. And in fact, that becomes a consistent theme in the argument that there is either an inadequate amount of evidence or there's something wrong with the evidence that's being presented. In this particular case, you say the lack of identification of who the researcher is might undermine the credibility of that information. I think you had a good follow-up by pointing out that there was no statistical information to show that there's a measurable effect. So all we have really is a theoretical conjecture by somebody that we don't know at this particular point, and we have no statistical information to suggest anything further beyond that. That's when it would be nice if you could step in with some comparative information. For example, if we had any information that showed that mental health issues had not changed dramatically in the last 20 years, or that there's been a decline in the number of people who are seeking assistance, or that people who report having more satisfaction in their life has increased, or something along those lines. Any kind of comparative data, because then you can simply say they've provided no data and I've given you at least some standard by which you can make a comparison. The second point on the issue of likes, mostly it's presses that you're talking about here. You say your evidence is talking about may or it's plausible. That's a reasonable press. There's not, in essence, you're suggesting that this is ambiguous and speculative sort of testimony, and it gets tied up with self-esteem, which is not necessarily the same thing. Here you did have start to have some competing evidence, and this seemed to be, to me, a little bit confusing, because your evidence seemed to suggest that there is a relationship, especially as we get to the cyberbullying issue. It's just apparently not as significant as the advocate said. If it's like on that second piece of evidence from the authorities that you spent quite a bit of time qualifying, it's 2 to 9 times more likely. That sounds pretty significant to me. I'm not exactly sure that you've diminished the argument in that particular situation. That still sounds like it's a pretty significant issue that's going on there. So I think that your attempt to use the evidence that way isn't helping you. It's kind of going the opposite direction for the conclusion that you're arguing about there. On the last point, I do think that you can get back to the same kinds of arguments that you're making earlier in the speech, and that is that there are general presses about the quantifiable impacts of this, the lack of evidence from the advocate on these particular issues, the absence of statistical information, and all there is a hypothetical. And again, I think you could come up with your own hypothetical in this situation, and again, any quantitative information that you had, even if it's tangential, is more specific than whatever they provided. And so I think maybe digging a little deeper might have given you a better answer on that. I like the presses that you had, but I do think that you're trying to rely on, just kind of poking at their evidence a little too much, and you want to do more than that. All right, thank you.